People event here. We're hosting from the Center for Global Education, and I have a speaker, Jeremy, who's joining us, who will be guiding us through this conversation today. I'm so excited to introduce him to you and our conversation. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Treaty 6 territory. So in Canada, Jeremy's going to go through a very amazing conversation about all of this. But as we started, as we know, we're going through a process called the reconciliation in Canada. And we've been on this journey for a number of years. And it's about, educating ourselves, examining our power and our privileges, thinking about the land and our relationship to it, relationship to people, our community and our roles with others in our community. And then what does it mean to be a settler or a colonizer? And how is our relationship always changing and dynamic? And what can we learn to be more responsible as citizens and people who live together in community? And so a part of that is acknowledging that I live and I'm joining you today from Treaty 6 territory. So it was the traditional meeting grounds and gathering spaces and traveling routes for the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, Nakota Sioux. And I want to acknowledge all the First Nations and Métis peoples whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. So as a part of my reconciliation process is acknowledging that and welcome you all joining us today from all over the world, from Bangladesh, from Canada, from the United States, and really engaging in this conversation. And I'm excited as we were having a little bit of a conversation before we went live, I'm excited to see what do these conversations mean outside of Canada even. And so I can't wait to get started on this. Jeremy, I want to welcome you to our program today. And maybe if we can start and you can tell a bit about yourself and who you are and how you got to the space that we're inviting you today.
Tanse kiwao ketamska tenawao piskis et mista temnetsiga sunegwa nagoa chico chenya maga amsku chiwas gegenek nuigene gwa netatoskan aya nihiona peo omania egwa uxkuno hamageo omania Edmonton Public Schools. Egwa nanasku munmio gisiga noche guakakio noako maganak. I always like to start that way when I present. For those of you that don't know, that is the Cree language, and it's really important for me to begin that way for many reasons. One reason is that I do believe that in this part of Canada, this part of the world, there aren't many people who are exposed to an Indigenous language. For some people, when I speak Cree, it's their first time maybe hearing an Indigenous language. And an Indigenous language is a language that has been, it comes from this place that where we're at. So in the Edmonton area, Cree has always been here. It comes from the land. It is a really old, really beautiful language. And so it's really my way of exposing people to some of the sounds of a really beautiful language. A second reason why I speak Cree when I introduce myself is that I am a language learner. When I was young, I went to French immersion school, K to 12. My mom is French and Irish, but my dad is a Cree man and his first language is Cree. And so when I was a child, I would hear different commands. I would hear words like, and tell me, you can either tell me by in the chat or show of hands if you know what this word means. If I said to you, astam, what would that mean? If I said to you, astam means to come. So I heard that a lot as a child. I heard words like this, awas.
Go away.
Go away, yeah, I probably heard that word the most out of any. And as I grew into adulthood, I decided that I wanted to learn more than just basic commands. And so about 6 years ago, I decided to embark on this language journey, and it's led me to a lot of beautiful places, a lot of beautiful people I've met. And so I get to practice. I practice here at work. I practice at home. I have 2 children. I use Cree with them as much as I can. We also have a cat. We gave her a Cree name and we practice Cree with her. I don't know if she understands it. I like to think she does, but maybe not always. And a third reason, and perhaps maybe a little more on a serious note, is that the reason why I speak Cree is because the language isn't supposed to be here anymore. The goal of the residential school system in Canada was to eradicate First Nations language and culture and ceremony. And at the government and church at the time tried really hard. They tried for over 150 years to eradicate us as people in terms of our language and our culture. But we're still here. We still have our language, we still have our culture, we still have our ceremonies. And so really, it's a way for me to acknowledge all those people who kept our language alive when it wasn't okay to do so. And it's a way to celebrate the fact that we still have our language. And so I like to celebrate the fact and speak Cree to a group of people and celebrate the fact that we are still here. So I said a lot in Cree. I greet all of you. I shake hands with all of you. My name is Jeremy. I come from a place in Saskatchewan called Sweetgrass First Nation. It's a reserve located just outside of North Battleford, Saskatchewan. It is in Treaty 6 territory as well. But I do live and work in the city of Edmonton, and you may have caught who I work for, Edmonton Public Schools. And I'm really grateful for this beautiful day we've been given, and I'm grateful to all my relations. And I'm here to, I guess, share a little of what I know about treaties. It's an ongoing process for me. It's an ongoing journey. I didn't grow up learning about this in school, much like most people my age or older. We didn't grow up learning about this. So it's really exciting that we have these opportunities like today to have these conversations. And I look forward to the change that it brings to my children's generation and all the generations that come after us, the change that these conversations are going to help shape and what that's going to bring for us. So very happy to be here. I'll walk you through a presentation shortly, and I'll break and we'll have some discussion about what it means to be in Treaty 6 territory, or whatever treaty territory you are in, coming to us today from. And I look forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for that introduction. And so I think it's so much more to hear your own story. And we talk about that. We do another project called Decarbonize, and we use a framework called Talanoa, where it's a Fijian indigenous framework where it's about storytelling, where we learn about each other and we learn about science and we learn about climate change, actually through the telling of stories. And I think there's just so much more power to hearing your knowledge of treaties through a lens of this is my own stories. These are my own understandings of it, because it doesn't have to be perfect. Sometimes it's our interpretations and our understandings and how we're on our learning journey and what we're taking and what we still need to learn, right? So thank you so much for joining and sharing that with us today. It looks like we've had a few more people log into a room, which is amazing. It's always great to see faces and to be talking, because we are live streaming this to YouTube, and we have people who are joining us there, and they're welcome to join in this conversation that's on Zoom right now through the chat. So Terry, you can see Terry's on, and if you're in the Zoom room, you can see him in the corner, and he's on the live stream and he's doing the chat there. So if you have a question for Jeremy, please type it in and Terry will bring it over here to us. And we have this sort of blinking going. We have it, it's all sort of established so that we can make sure that you get the most out of today, because I'm sure, though Jeremy's still learning as well, he's here to help you understand what do these things mean? If you have a particular question that's personal to you or that to where you are, I'm sure he will try his best to either give you a resource where you can find an answer or reach out to someone else, or perhaps provide his own perspective. So please, if you're in the room, we'd love to hear from you. And we'd also like to see where you're from. So we have someone from Bangladesh joining us. We have Nunavut, we have Edmonton. And so if you are able to rename yourself or type in the chat and we will rename you so we can have an idea of where you're joining from. So thank you and welcome. We have Adam's joined us as well from Edmonton Public School, and he's been huge in helping us facilitate this conversation today. So I want to acknowledge him and welcome him to the meeting as well. But Jeremy, please, I want to hold it or pass it over to you to continue.
Okay, awesome. So I'm going to share my presentation. This is all relatively new for me, so we will try our best and try to get you hooked up here to my screen. Give me 1 second.
You bet.
Sorry.
Maybe while Jeremy's doing that, I just want to do a quick reminder to all of our friends who are joining us via live stream that there's also an opportunity for you to post questions, comments. We can have a little bit of a side dialogue that's going on there as well. And then what we'll do is we won't necessarily share your questions right away, but we'll kind of bring your questions in a time that works well for the presentation and for what Jeremy's sharing with us. Looks like the screen's up, so back to you, Jeremy.
Awesome, thank you. So yeah, the title and kind of the idea that I want to have you walk away with is this idea, this phrase that we are all treaty people, and we'll get into that a little more. As I mentioned, I am still learning about treaty. I'm not an expert on treaty. There's many different perspectives about treaty. I'll try to bring you, again, my perspective, as Sarah mentioned, and try to help you along the way better understand what this phrase means and the idea of treaty altogether. But I guess I'm really curious to know, and what is a treaty in your understanding, each and every one of you who are tuning in, what is a treaty? There are many definitions for a treaty, and there's not one right definition, but I'm just curious to see where you're at with your understanding about treaty. And so I'm not sure if Sarah and Terry, you can help me with this, and if anyone wants to type in the chat what your thoughts are about treaty, what
Are you able to still hear? Have we? Terry, are you able to give me a thumbs up on whether or not he's coming?
I'll work with Jeremy in the background. If you just want to continue to host, that would be great.
So we have here, Megan has written, it's a binding agreement. And I mean, they are a legal agreement within our country. And so I think there's a lot of maybe controversy around even the bindingness of it, right? And what has been our responsibilities as a society in meeting the terms of the agreement. So interesting, yes. And Megan, do you have any thoughts on the nature of that binding agreement and how that's played out? And Megan, I'd love to know where you're joining us from, if you wanted to add that as well, and we'll get to you. Does anyone else in the meeting here have an idea of what treaties means to you, or what you think of when you hear the word treaty? I know, as Jeremy was saying, when I was younger, I didn't learn about treaties in school. And so it wasn't until I moved to Edmonton that I became more exposed to the language of treaties as what they were, how we had failed and in meeting sort of our treaty requirements and what that meant and the impacts of that. And NISA has a peace agreement between two subjects. And you know what, I think that's lovely because that is the spirit of it, right? It's an idea that two groups of people, two groups of people can come together and form an agreement through peace, through dialogue, through coming to consensus, and really sort of making an agreement based on that. That's one formed on trust and mutual trust. Thank you, Anissa. That's a great sort of the spirit of the document versus maybe having it just illegal and what the relationship between those can be. Does anyone else have something they would like to from their? I know that in different areas of Canada, there's different sorts of treaties. Some lands are unceded territories, and they aren't bound by a treaty. And then in other areas of Canada, they do, whether it be that we have all sorts of different relationships and amongst our land and with relationships to the government. In Nunavut, Bernard, do you know perhaps if there's a treaty agreement that on the land that you're on? I can unmute you if you'd like.
Hey, Sarah, I'm not up to date on my history. My
No.
understanding is for the Inuit, there were no treaties. Someone can correct me out there. And it was probably starting in the 1980s that leaders from different parts of Canada, all across the Arctic, the different leaders got together and they set up land claims agreements. So for Nunavut, that came into effect with the creation of Nunavut, April the 1st, 1999. Officially, it was ratified, I think, in 1989. So it took 10 years before they could actually put the government structure into place. So that's my vague recollection of my history.
Oh, well, thanks so much for sharing, Bernard. I put you on the spot there, didn't I? So I appreciate your sharing what you know. I mean, I will have to do some more investigating myself, or perhaps ask Jeremy for additional context if he knows. There's the expansive nature of the relationships between the treaties themselves are so specific to the needs of each area that it's hard, I'm sure, for Jeremy to know what was agreed on in Ontario versus Nunavut versus Treaty 6 here in Alberta. So it'll be wonderful to get that perspective as well.
Jeremy, is your audio, we lost you there for a second. Are you back?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh yes, please. Yeah, go right ahead. We were just filling space. We weren't sure if you were back online.
Yeah. No, I was tuning in to everything that was said. Thank you for those of you that contributed to the conversation. Yeah, I don't know much about the North. I do know there are modern land claims that are created.
Oh goodness. I think we've lost his audio again. I wonder.
So Jeremy, I'm just going to send you a little bit of a note. Okay. Do we have you back again?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure where I cut out. I'll just kind of restart, but there's many different perspectives on treaty, as I mentioned. There's legal perspectives. There's perspectives.
Yeah, we're going to, sorry about this, everyone. Jeremy's connection isn't great. Jeremy, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you a phone number that you can call into, and then we'll be able to get your, just because it looks like your internet connection is a little bit sketchy.
Okay.
And as can be these times, who knows who else is in your neighborhood and doing their school lessons at the same time, watching videos, or it might be. But I'm going to send you a phone number, Jeremy, and then I'm going to get you to call in on that. How does that sound?
Maybe I'm gonna ask Adam, who is also a member of the FNMI team at Edmonton Public Schools. When you're having your conversations with within Edmonton Public or with other educators around treaties, what are the, oh, I see you moving. What are some of the conversations that are happening in schools right now around treaties and the learning that's happening in our schools?
Hello, everyone. Thank you. I'm just stepping outside. My wife is in a separate video conference on the same floor. And my kids are doing some art at the kitchen table. So I guess for my work, seeing what's going on in the schools in Edmonton Public is I think a lot of our schools have done a lot of learning about residential schools over the last few years, and there's been like lots of teaching and learning about residential schools, but there hasn't been like a whole lot of learning about treaties. So from my perspective, it seems like a lot of teachers and students in our schools are really learning about sort of treaties for the first time and learning more about them, and when they were signed, why they were signed, the intentions for signing them. And people still have lots of questions about myths and things that they've heard about treaties. And we do the treaty acknowledgement every morning, or a lot of schools do the treaty acknowledgement every morning, or at least at their school assemblies. So there's that treaty acknowledgement out there that a lot of people and schools do. And so I think there's awareness, a lot of awareness about treaties, but I think people are still looking to really start their learning. I hope that answered your question.
It does. Thank you. And I think, Jeremy, we have you back. We're just going to go without the, if you want to send me your presentation, I will quickly share it. If not, we can just go without, and we'll look at your, we'll have a conversation with you.
I'll try to share it with you here. I'll just give me 2 seconds.
There is no hurry as well. So you can start talking, and I'm sure we can.
Okay.
Well, unfortunately, it looks so we've lost him again.
Since what everyone talked about and chimed in about so far is that
I can see that you're speaking, or Jeremy, but unfortunately we aren't able to hear you. We might ask that you join via phone.
Yeah, I just sent you, Jeremy, on the chat there. I sent you a phone number that if you could dial in, that would be great. I think that we're just it seems to kind of come and go in terms of the in terms of the internet on the site.
Oh, live events. We appreciate everyone's patience. What I did see that Megan had shared that is she from Williams? But there are treaties in her area. And then I know that we have another, is it Karen from York is joining us as well? Wonderful. And do you in your communities do the land acknowledgement as a part of your schooling and the everyday sort of processes of educating?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'm in York Region, which is just north of Toronto. I work with the school board, and it varies among different schools, but certainly in any organized event, there's always a land acknowledgement. So when I hear Williams Treaty, there's an extra voice. Are people hearing me?
It looks
yeah, we can hear you, but Jeremy, if you're able to turn off your speaker, we have a bit of a loop that's happening on your side. If you can turn down the speaker on your computer, then I think we're good to go.
Okay, I think we're good. I try that now.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I will share later or in the chat. Let's hear from Jeremy. Thanks.
All
right. Yeah. Sorry. Thanks everyone for your patience. Yeah, I was just talking about the treaties are between, in the case of Treaty 6, they are between 2 nations, and the nations that Treaty 6, the interested parties are the British Crown and First Nations people. First Nations people are and were their own nations. They had their own governments, their own laws, their own customs, everything in place, everything that makes up a nation was in place for them. So they agreed nation to nation
with the British Crown. Now, on paper, when you look at the legal document for Treaty number 6, you'll really only come across those two parties, those two interested parties, First Nations people and the British Crown. That's from a British perspective, who that agreement is made between. From a First Nations perspective, there's more parties involved. First Nations people have made this agreement with the British Crown, but they also made it with the Creator, because there were certain ceremonies that were conducted at the time of treaty making that brought in the Creator as a witness. And so from a First Nations perspective, Treaty 6 is an agreement between not only First Nations and the British Crown, but between our Creator. And so it makes it a sacred agreement. It is a very, very special agreement, and one that's not taken lightly from a First Nations perspective. So the promises, and we'll talk about some of those things coming up that were made, they're taken very, very seriously. They're not taken lightly. And those promises that were made, because they're made in front of the Creator, with the Creator, that they are taken very, very, very seriously. I'm not sure, Sarah, can you advance the slide for me, please? So treaties, it's important to note that before European contact, the idea of treaty making, the concept of treaty making was already in place. It was in place between different First Nations people. So for example, in this territory where we live, in let's say Alberta, we have a lot of different First Nations people. We have Cree people, we have Nakota Sioux, we have Saulteaux, we have Blackfoot, we have Dene, we have a lot of different groups of people, each their own individual nations. Now, treaties are made between those individual nations before the arrival of Europeans. So in our territory, the Cree and the Blackfoot went through variations of different treaties with each other. They were sometimes upheld, they sometimes weren't. There was a lot of up and down with that. But treaties were in place. And so upon the arrival of European contact, the European people adopted these practices. And the reason why we have Treaty 6 from a legal perspective is because of something called the Royal Proclamation, which was created in 1763. This is really the foundational document that these treaties we're going to talk about that they rest upon. And basically what the Royal Proclamation says is that the King George III, who created this Royal Proclamation, he said that First Nations people are basically, they hold title to the land. They are the owners of the land. And the only way that European people or newcomers can gain title to that land, like a legal perspective, legally speaking, was by making treaties with First Nations people. That's following their law. And so they weren't going to go in there and fight. It was set upon by law that they had to enter into these treaty agreements, which is why we have these treaties we are going to talk about. So the Royal Proclamation, it's important to know that it is the foundation for these treaties that we, Treaty number 6, for example, and it's the reason why we have them. And we'll get into more details about what those treaties are. If we can advance to the next slide, please. So yeah, it was mentioned, and there's people I know from other parts of the country and other parts of the world, but this is a map of Canada. And there's a lot of different things going on here, a lot of different colors. And the different colors represent different treaty areas. Now, to the east, you'll see peace and friendship treaties that were established 1725 to 1779. Then as we move west, you see the Upper Canada land surrenders, you see Williams treaties, the Robinson Superior treaties. Way over in the west on Vancouver Island, you'll see the Douglas treaties. So these are all, again, they're treaties for peace and friendship, for land acquisition. These are kind of the treaties that established what we are going to talk about with the numbered treaties. And what you see, you'll see numbers 1 to 11. And those are Canada's, referred to as Canada's numbered treaties. They're very, very significant because really, in essence, they are the foundation for what we call Canada. Without these treaties, Canada as we know it, or the provinces as we know them, do not exist, or they look very, very different from what they do now. And you will see Treaty number 1 starts in present-day southern Manitoba. And it kind of works its way through, kind of goes back and forth, east to west, makes its way out west here into present day Alberta. But for those of you that are in Alberta, you probably know that Alberta became a province in 1905. And you'll notice that Treaty Number 6 was agreed upon in 1876. Treaty Number 7 in southern Alberta was 1877. And Treaty Number 8 in the northern part of Alberta and BC and the Northwest Territories was agreed upon in 1899. So these predate the province of Alberta. So from a legal perspective, these treaties were significant because without these treaties, the British Crown does not acquire title to the land from their perspective. So by entering into this treaty, according to their law, they acquire title to the land. So they're able to create these provinces. Now, we have kind of an issue here with that from a First Nations perspective, because as First Nations people, we do not see the land as something that you can own. That is a foreign concept, or it was, and at the time would have been a huge foreign concept, because you can't own land. You know, land, we have a unique relationship with the land, with the earth, with all living things, and to claim ownership over them it just doesn't make sense. You can share, you can interact, you can relate to them, but the idea of owning a piece of property, owning land, would have been a foreign concept. So for First Nations people, they have a different perspective on these treaties, which we will get into a little bit later. But the idea was to share the land. It wasn't to give up title to the land, because they never saw themselves as owners in the first place. But from the government perspective, from the British Crown perspective, their idea was entering into treaties was to acquire title to the land. It's really interesting to note in Treaty 6, which stretches over both Alberta and Saskatchewan, the borders are very unique. To the south of Treaty 6, going into Treaty 7, the natural border, the natural boundary is the Red Deer River. So if you live in Edmonton and you drive to Calgary, as soon as you cross the Red Deer River, you're actually leaving Treaty 6 territory and you're entering into Treaty 7 territory. And to the north, what separates Treaty 6 from Treaty 8 is the Athabasca River. That is the natural boundary. So as you're going through, going north, and you cross that Athabasca River, you're actually leaving Treaty 6, entering into Treaty 8. Now, I don't particularly know. I know for sure at the Red Deer River and what separates Treaty 6 and 7, there's no signs to say that there is a treaty area that you're leaving or coming into, but it'd be cool one day to have some acknowledgement of that, to highlight the importance of those treaty areas, much like we do when we cross provincial boundaries or international boundaries. There is usually signage to say that you are entering into another province or you're leaving a province. I think it'd be cool one day to have signs to show that we are leaving and entering into different treaty areas. Can we move on to the next slide, please? I'm really curious, and this is a question for everyone, whether you want to chime in or else in person or on the chat, but who benefits from, well, in this case, Treaty 6, but who benefits maybe if you're in a different treaty area, who benefits from that agreement? I'm really curious to know what your thoughts are around that.
I shouldn't speak for Anissa, but I know that when she was asked, when she put forward what she thought a treaty was, she said it was a peace agreement. So I think from that perspective, it would benefit everyone, in that it would be an agreement that everyone sort of entered into with the spirit of communal benefits.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely.
Let's see. Anyone? I think they're waiting for your answer.
No, that's okay. We'll move on to the next slide. You know, I'll just talk about some of the benefits from a First Nations perspective. Now, The reason why, so we talked about why the British Crown wanted to go into treaty making, because they had to by law in order to acquire title to the land. They wanted to create a country called Canada. And in order to do that, they needed land. And so that was their motivation for entering into these treaties. But for First Nations people, why would they enter into a treaty with newcomers? Well, there's a lot of things happening at the time. In the 1870s, around the time of treaty making, a lot of things were happening. A lot of newcomers were coming. A lot of settlers were arriving. With that came really the destruction of the bison or the buffalo, which was the primary food source for people in this area, and they were being hunted to near extinction, and not even hunted; they were just being shot and really just wasted. And so, of course, with First Nations people being so heavily dependent on the buffalo, on the bison, a lot of people were going hungry. A lot of people were starving because there was no food around. There's also diseases, introduction of European diseases. So for First Nations people, these were new. They never had the immunity to fend them off. And so a lot of people were getting sick. A lot of people were dying. And so really, they were negotiating these treaties really from a point of weakness, because, you know, you had no food, your people were sick, you were basically dying. And so they believed by agreeing to this treaty, they would get some government assistance, some help. And so one of the reasons, the benefits, was the physical survival of their nations. They could actually physically survive. Sarah, you talked about it, the peaceful relations with the newcomers, and as mentioned in the chat, a peace agreement. It was agreed upon that there would be peace with the newcomers. They believed that their cultural and spiritual survival as distinct nations would be their traditions, their customs, their institutions, their languages, their education systems, everything would be preserved and it wouldn't be interfered with. That was the idea. They can continue to operate as a nation without outside interference. And again, they were hoping to get help, assistance with transition to a new lifestyle. So in this part of Canada, farming was kind of the way. And so they were hoping by agreeing to this treaty that they would get assistance with that transition to a new lifestyle. We can go to the next slide, please. So part of the provisions. So this is where a lot of misconceptions come into play. So again, the treaty was agreed upon in 1876, and the agreement from a First Nations perspective was to share the land. It wasn't to give up the land. It wasn't to give up the title. Their understanding was we are going to agree to share it. In exchange for sharing the land and the resources, they were to get certain things. And here's a list of some of those things. So farm equipment, farm animals, annuities. Annuity is an annual payment. And I'm just really curious to know, this is where I guess a lot of misconceptions come in, that myself, I'm a treaty Indian. That's the legal title that I'm given, one of the legal titles that I'm given. And I have a lot of people, and I've grown up and we're hearing a lot of different things about that we as treaty Indians, we get all this stuff. We get a lot of money. We get a lot of things for free. We don't pay taxes. There's all this whole list of things, of things that we get. But basically, I can tell you that these annuities, these annual payments, they're not much. I can tell you that. So back in 1876, if you were a chief, you were to receive $25. If you were a council member or a headman, you were to receive $15. And everyone else in your band who followed you, they were to receive $5 a year. So back then, that was a decent amount of money. But you know, they never talked about in these treaty negotiations the idea of inflation and what it would look like in 2020. And so to this day, I still get an annual payment of $5. And really, it's not much. I can't do much with that $5. but every Treaty Indian in this area, in Treaty 6 territory, would have that right. They would be given that right to an annuity. So we get $5 a year, and we collect it from the government on behalf of the Crown, because again, that agreement, these treaties agreements are with the British Crown. They're not with the country of Canada. And so usually we have a representative from the British Crown who we meet with, we shake hands with, and it's usually an RCMP officer in their red serge. And we shake their hand and we get our $5. And really, it's really symbolic because it's not so much about the money we're getting, but it's about that relationship that we have. We are renewing that relationship on an annual basis, and we're reminding ourselves that we are in agreement with each other. We made these agreements, these promises to one another, and we are renewing them on a yearly basis. So we get $5 a year. That's the only amount of money that I make as a Treaty Indian. On behalf of the government or the British Crown, I get $5 a year, so it's not much. I can't retire off of that. You know, I can't go on a trip with that. I can maybe buy a Starbucks coffee with that, or Tim Hortons or McDonald's or your preference, whatever your coffee preference is. But it can't get me much. Funny story is that I haven't collected my treaty money since 2006. So last year, there's a reserve nearby that had their treaty days, and I was able to go to that reserve and I was able to collect my $5. But the thing is, they hold on to it for every year. So I collected $5 from 2006 to 2019, and so I can't remember whatever the math is on that, but they don't give you like a $50 bill. Okay. They give you everything in $5 bills. So you walk away feeling like a total baller. You're rocking all the $5 bills, and you got a whole wad of $5 bills. So it's a kind of a cool feeling, but it's really symbolic. It's all $5 bills. And so I collected. I'm up to date now. So this year I'll collect $5, and I can go and enjoy a nice coffee. We were given ammunition, rights to hunt and fish in our traditional territory. We still have that today. We can hunt on our reserves year round. Establishments of schools on reserve land. This isn't residential schools. Our understanding was we were going to get schools where we can educate our own children in our own way. The medicine chest, which is basically, at the time, we talked about those diseases. And if people were getting sick, there was a farm instructor on every reserve, usually a non-Indigenous man, who had basically like a first aid kit. And if you got sick, you can go and see that farm instructor and you can get the medicine that you need. So that's really interpreted today to mean universal health care. And so it just depends on how it's interpreted. And part of the deal was you were to get rations during times of pestilence and famine, because transitioning to a new lifestyle of farming, it wasn't a guarantee. There could be drought. There could be a lot of different factors that come into play where you don't grow a crop and you might go hungry. So the idea was the government would provide you rations to food and liquids to get you through these times of hardship. So that was kind of the benefits, the provisions that First Nations people were to receive. And if we could go to the next slide.
Well, before we do, there's a few questions on these sorts of agreements. And Megan had one question about the Williams treaties, and that for Alberta, the buffalo supply was like a keen sort of factor of food and pelts and all that sort of, but in Ontario, buffalo aren't really roaming free. Like, was it very much based on what the currency in the area was in terms of the what was in the agreements? So is this very specific to Treaty 6, these agreements, or do they sort of share commonalities across the treaty members?
There are some commonalities amongst the treaties. Basically, each treaty built upon the other treaty. And so if you're in Treaty 1, Treaty 2, people talked. First Nations people talked. They knew what was being agreed upon. It's not like these treaties came and surprised them. They very much knew what was going on, and so they would learn from one treaty what was agreed upon, and maybe they would negotiate a different term or an additional term in another treaty that suits their area. So I don't know much about the Eastern treaties or about the treaties in Ontario, or the treaties number 1 leading up to number 6. I don't know too much about those, but I do know. I would say, like you said, Sarah, it would be like kind of the regional currency that you would negotiate, whether that was timber, trees, forests, etc. Here it just happened to be the buffalo in this territory, so I can't really say too much on the eastern part. I'm sorry, but I would say it would be that local currency, whatever that would be.
Fishing or whatever. Yeah, awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Karen had a question about the exchange of currency, of the $5. And she was wondering, do these exchanges, symbolic exchanges, occur across Canada with RCMP? Or are there other assigned officers that work in certain areas?
Mm-hmm. To my knowledge, it is RCMP officers. That's how my experience has been. I could be wrong on that in other parts of the country, but again, the idea of this treaty, these numbered treaties, were between the Queen and First Nations people, the British Crown, and so I know that the Governor General isn't involved in any way. To my knowledge, it's someone with maybe lower status and then the Governor General. The Queen herself doesn't come. I know that. So to my knowledge, it is the RCMP, and I'd love to know if there are in other parts of Canada, if there's someone other than RCMP officers who act on behalf of the British Crown. I'd be really, really curious to know that. And so this is where I guess I like to, tell the other side of that coin. Quite often, I think we focus on how First Nations benefit from treaty, and that when we do these acknowledgements, whether you're in Treaty 6 territory like Sarah did at the start, or if you acknowledge in Ontario or BC, parts of Ontario or BC, you'll acknowledge that you're on unceded territory. But a lot of the focus I find tends to be on the First Nations side of things, and the benefits that First Nations people receive, such as money and all these different things that I just talked about. But I find we forget about the other side of that coin, that the other side of that agreement. And again, there's two parties involved. So First Nations people benefit; they get certain benefits from this treaty. Well, what did the British Crown receive? Well, they receive peaceful access, so they're able to create a country, whether that's for farms, railroads, roads, communities, etc. They wanted peace. They wanted lower costs. They wanted to avoid what the United States was doing to the south. The United States was going at it a different way. They were going about it in a really violent way, a very bloody, a very costly way. And being a young nation, there just wasn't the bankroll to fund something like that. And the Royal Proclamation states that this must be done. According to that law, they need to enter into treaties. And they were really worried that the U.S. would come up from the south and acquire the title to the land in what is now Western Canada. So by entering these treaties, the Crown believed they would acquire title to the land for their use, so they can create a country called Canada. And so if we can go to the next slide, I'm just curious, like, what does this phrase mean to you when you hear it? We are all treaty people. I talked about how, as First Nations people, I feel that when we talk about treaty, it only benefits, or it only talking about them in the conversation. We often don't think about us and everyone who lives in this area, how they benefit. And so this term, we are all treaty people, do you agree with that? Is it something you can relate to? Do you feel, as maybe a non-Indigenous person, that you are a treaty person? Do you consider yourself a treaty person if you are non-Indigenous? I'm really curious to hear thoughts or see it in the chat about what that means to you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for the lead in there, and for the overview of sorry.
No, that's totally fine. Here, I'll step in a little bit for Sarah as we all deal with the realities of having little ones at home. Jeremy, it's such a fascinating question because as we wait we have some great participants who've been posting their ideas and their questions in the chat, and we're really looking forward to people adding to that dialogue. It's really taken for me, the biggest shift was moving it from an us and them to an us and us. You know, that this is something that we share. This is something that because we're all treaty people, then we also have a responsibility to understand it and to encourage a dialogue around it. And so yeah, like my biggest shift when I think of it as we are all treaty people is it shifts it from an us and them to an us and us. And and that we're coming to this on a certain grounds as equals, and balancing out a power dynamic that is just not true.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and that's where I was hoping to go with this. So you took us there, and I think it's great. I'm curious to know if anyone else has any thoughts around that.
Megan posted here, she said yes, and Megan's from Toronto, and I actually wasn't aware. I always thought that the treaties were all numbered, but Megan shared with me that she was part of the Williams treaties, and then when you shared that map, I saw that as well. I just assumed that they were all numbers, but Megan shared that first, so thanks, Megan, for helping me learn that. But Megan shared, I've heard this term before, and I think it's a great lead-in to teach about Indigenous peoples. So again, rather than starting from a perspective of kind of an us and here I am, I'm this non-Indigenous person and they're an Indigenous person, and rather than starting from that clear separation, but we actually start from a place of equals. And then we start to learn about the very important differences in cultures that are there. But we start with something that we share.
Yeah, and in essence, we even though none of us were there at the time, like, it doesn't matter where you live. I guess if you live in Treaty 6, or if you live in the area where the Williams treaties were agreed to, none of us were there at the time that these were entered into. But we all, because we're here today, because we live in a peaceful place, because we can drive on roads, because we can hop on a train, because because we can farm, we all benefit from living here. We all do, and there's an ugly history attached to that. But I think if we can focus on the spirit and intent of that relationship, what it was supposed to be, it was supposed to be, again, an agreement between two nations that were going to respect each other, that we're going to learn from each other, that we're going to support one another. The spirit and intent of that, I think that's something that we can do. We can't go back and change things, but we do have a responsibility to uphold our own side of the deal. We have an obligation, and it doesn't matter if you've been here your whole life on this territory or if you're new to this territory, but we benefit greatly from living here. And I think if we can keep that in mind, that idea of relationship, and again, taking it away, like you said, Terry, from an us and them to an us and us, that we just at the core level, we are all human, and we relate to one another at that level, that we can work towards improving that relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country. And I see there that you'd like to open it up to questions for the last few minutes. That's cool too. So thank you, Sarah.
I know that for me, as the students write that, I think of, you hear people talk about, well, we should get rid of the treaties, that we're all in Canada, we're all Canadians, and when we would never think of, in 1818, the British Crown signed a treaty just like the ones they signed with Indigenous people, with the United States, saying this is where the Canadian border ends and the American border starts. There is no difference between the treaties that were signed between Canada and the US in 1818 which is even older than the treaties that we signed here in Canada. We would never think of canceling those treaties. So why would we think of canceling another treaty? Because if you can cancel one, then you can cancel another. And it's interesting, this double metric that we apply to this. But treaties are what this world is based on for understandings. But it's, anyways, that's just a,
yeah, and I think that leads to an important note too, that this treaty that we are in here in the Edmonton area, Treaty 6, there's no expiry date on it. You know, they never at the time of negotiation said, okay, on April 28th, 2020, this treaty is going to expire. That's not the case. There's another phrase that goes with this, and it's for as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow, which highlights the Indigenous people's relationship to land. But it also means that this treaty really, you know, if the sun stops shining, then not only does that treaty expire, but we as humans, we expire as well. And so in essence, when you say that phrase, it means that these treaties are meant to last forever. And there's no expiration date on them at all. And so they are to be for as long as the sun shines and the grass grows and the rivers flow.
Now, I'm wondering if any of our other participants have a question or a comment, perhaps from the live stream or here in the room. I know, Anissa, we had been talking before the conference started about what was your perspective coming from Bangladesh and hearing this conversation about, you know, the treaties that were made between those that came from Europe and the people who were living on the land before, and you yourself live in a country that was, the British came in and established their laws and the rest. What's your perspective on hearing this conversation today?
Well, first of all, I got to know a lot about treaties that I didn't know before, so that was really helpful. And I thought that the treaties we had in our country, like before splitting up of the Indian subcontinent, and like after we got the liberation war agreement, like the agreement that gave our liberation, we emerged as another country. These are all very important historic moments, and they actually have a lot of emphasis as to what the country is like currently. So yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for sharing that with us, Anissa.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, in the last minutes here before we end the day, of course, we welcome you to share more questions if you have, whether it be following up by email or Twitter. We're always here to help you get access to more education, more knowledge, and I'm sure that our friends from the Edmonton Public Schools here would be happy to share. I know that I've shared some of the sources on the presentation, but if you would like those as well, please follow up with us here at the Center for Global Education. We're welcome to share those with you as well. Jeremy, do you have any last sort of few words that you'd like to share with our audience on treaties today before we close out?
Well, I just think it's really cool to see things happening, have these discussions taking place, and I've seen the direct results of it. And a great example is here in Edmonton, we have a mall. It's not West Edmonton Mall, even though that is the mall most people think about. We have a mall called Kingsway Mall. So one day I was driving by Kingsway on the way to the office. This is probably about 2 years ago. And on the corner of their property, they have 3 flagpoles. And there was 3 flags blowing in the wind. And one flag was the Canadian flag. One flag was the Alberta flag, and then to my surprise, I almost ran off the road. I saw a Treaty 6 flag flying in the wind. Now, the Treaty 6 flag was gifted to First Nations people by the Queen, and it's a very unique flag. It's a Union Jack with a treaty medal on it to highlight that relationship, this agreement that we have in place. And this is the flag that was blowing in the wind, and I was like, wow. this is crazy. Like, what is a mall doing flying a Treaty 6 flag? This is crazy. And so I called the mall. I called Kingsway Mall, and I was like, I finally got to someone. I was like, first of all, I think this is super cool. And second of all, how did you guys come to fly a Treaty 6 flag at the mall? And so they told me the story, and it was a story that was in the news, and it was really a way for them as the ownership group of the mall to raise the awareness of their own history, of things they didn't learn, Indigenous awareness. And so it led to a creation of an elders council, and they created some awareness things. And one of the things they decided to do was fly this flag. And so it flies throughout the year, like it rotates with other flags, like the Kingsway Mall flag and the Pride flag. But the last I checked, that flag was flying. And so I think the conversations that we're having today, which again gets me really excited, because this is change that I've seen already in a really short period of time. To have a mall of all places fly a Treaty 6 flag, I look forward to seeing where these flags are going to be flown once all you young people, you have these conversations and create a lot of positive change. To see where that takes us, that makes me really, really excited, and I look forward to it. And I just want to thank everyone for your time today, and wherever you're coming in from, it's you know, you can probably find a lot better things to do than listen to me talk. So I really appreciate you being here, taking the time. I hope you learned something, and yeah, I wish you well on your learning journey as you continue to learn more about treaties and Indigenous people. So thank you.
Well, Jeremy, I just want to say thank you. I know Karen sent a note in the chat saying thank you, and she appreciated your perspectives and more knowledge and understand. I just want to echo that thank you for sharing your time today. And I feel like we have all sort of moved forward in what we understand and what we know that we need to maybe investigate further, whether it be where we are or in our own areas, and planting those seeds of inquiry and of exploration. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to everyone joining us on live stream. We hope to see you again soon. Goodbye, everyone.